Judges chapter 6, I'll begin reading in verse 25. That night, the Lord said to him, that is Gideon, "Take your father's bull, the prized bull, 7 years old, and pull down the altar of Baal that your father has, and cut down the Asherah that is beside it. And build an altar to the Lord your God on top of the stronghold here, with stones laid in due order. Then take the prized bull and offer it as a burnt offering on the wood of the Asherah that you shall cut down." And so Gideon took 10 men of his servants and did as the Lord had told him. But because he was too afraid of his family and the men of the town to do it by day, he did it by night. And when the men of the town arose early in the morning, behold, the altar of Baal was broken down, and the Asherah beside it was cut down, and the prized bull was offered on the altar that had been built. And they said to one another, "Who has done this thing?" And after they had searched and inquired, they said, "Gideon, the son of Joash, has done this thing." Then the men of the town said to Joash, "Bring out your son that he may die, for he has broken down the altar of Baal and cut down the Asherah beside it." But Joash said to all who stood against him, "Will you contend for Baal, or will you save him? Whoever contends for him shall be put to death by morning. If he is God, let him contend for himself, because his altar has been broken down." Therefore on that day Gideon was called Jerubbaal, that is to say, "Let Baal contend against him, because he has broken down his altar." And now all the Midianites, the Amalekites, and the people of the east came together, and they crossed over the Jordan and encamped in the valley of Jezreel. But the Spirit of the Lord clothed Gideon, and he sounded the trumpets, and the Abiezerites were called out to follow him. And he sent messengers throughout all Manasseh, and they too were called out to follow him. And he sent messengers to Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, and they went up to meet him. But then Gideon said to God, "If you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said, behold, I am laying a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is any dew on the fleece alone, and it is dry on all the ground, then I shall know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said." And it was so. When he rose early the next morning and squeezed the fleece, he wrung out enough of the dew of the fleece to fill a bowl with water. Then Gideon said to God, "Let not your anger burn against me. Let me speak just once more. Please let me test just once more with the fleece. Please let it be dry on the fleece only, and on all the ground let there be dew." And God did so that night. It was dry on the fleece only, and on all the ground there was dew. Grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of the Lord endures forever. Baalism, or the worship of the Canaanite god Baal, was if not a perennial problem for the people of Israel. Regularly and repeatedly throughout their religious lives in the land, they abandoned the Lord to worship Baal. In fact, Baal worship first happens in the life of Israel before they even enter into the land. In Numbers chapter 25, when they marry Moabite women and they start worshiping Baal at Peor. And that worship of Baal persists throughout much of the history of Israel. And it's even a reason that the prophet Jeremiah tells us that they will be carried off into exile. It's a particular sin for the people of Israel that they return back to over and over and over again. Indeed, it is the sin of the book of Judges. Remember back in chapter 2 and verse 11, where the sin that the Lord confronts the people of Israel for throughout this book is the sin of idolatry. But twice in those handful of verses, it's not just idolatry in the abstract, it's the worship of Baal in particular. Chapter 2, verse 11 tells us how the people of Israel did the evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. And again it tells us in chapter 2 and verse 13 that they abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Asherah. Baal was a particular temptation for the people of Israel. In fact, if you were to go and to consider the various names of God in the Old Testament and all the times that they are used, you would find that they occur many thousands of times. And it's actually quite rare that the Old Testament refers to other Canaanite deities by name, with the exception of Baal. Baal is used and shows up by name about 150 times throughout the Old Testament, often with his consort Asherah right in tow. But it's into that context of the sin of Baalism for the period of Judges, of the issue of worshiping this particular false god that persists throughout the life of Israel, that Judges chapter 6 stands out quite clear. Because the Lord wants to make one very potent point for us here this evening. It is that he is the one and only true God who is to be feared. The Lord in Judges chapter 6, verses 25 through 40, comes to contend with Baal and to tell the people of Israel, as clear as it can be said, that Baal is not God. The Lord, he is God. Indeed, he is God alone, and therefore, he is the one that they should worship. He is the one that they should fear, rather than Baal, or rather than man. As we consider this, I think it'll teach us a number of key things about our own spiritual lives as well, calling us to cherish and fear the Lord above all things and above all people in this life. 4 points as we consider how this passage reveals that the Lord is the one true God who is to be feared rather than Baal. First, how the Lord contends with Baal, verses 25 through 27. Second, in the response from the town, verses 28 through 32. Third, in the call to arms, 33 through 35. And then lastly, in the sign of the fleece, verses 36 through 40. Well, our narrative begins in a fairly odd way. If you've been paying attention as we've been working our way through the book of Judges so far, it's been a fairly structured piece of literature. All of the various cycles follow in a similar pattern. The people of Israel sin. They cry out to the Lord after he had raised up oppressors against them. The Lord appoints a judge. The judge summons the people. They go and they wage war against their oppressors. Well, notice that that's not the pattern here in Judges chapter 6. The people have done evil. The Lord has raised up an oppressor. They did cry out to the Lord, and the Lord has appointed the judge. But instead of immediately going out to deal with the Midianites, this lengthy narrative has the Lord coming to deal first with Baal. You see, when we're thinking about the judgeship of Gideon, the Lord does not first go to war against Israel's oppressors, but first goes to war against Israel's idols. He goes to topple over the false gods whom they regularly forsake the Lord and whore after. This twist in the narrative, an unexpected portion of the book, draws our attention to how the Lord wishes to illustrate for Israel and for us that he is the only true God. It teaches Israel to turn away from the service of Baal and to humble themselves before the Lord, who is their Redeemer, who is their God, and who will be the one to deliver them, even from the hand of their Midianite oppressors. This little twist in the narrative takes us to consider how Baal is no God at all. And the way the Lord does this is that on the very night of his call to Gideon as a judge, he commissions him to go and to tear down the altar of Baal. Notice verse 25. That night the Lord said to him. Just a few hours earlier was when the Lord had called Gideon into the service of judgeship, had in a manifold way reinforced the reality that he would be with Gideon to deliver the people of Israel out of the hands of their oppressors, and even had been patient with him, giving him the sign of the meal, till Gideon had finally realized that this truly is the Lord who was in his presence. He had recognized that the Lord was with him, and the Lord was at peace with Gideon. But the Lord is not at peace with Baal. The Lord tells Gideon first, before he ever goes to deal with Israel's oppressors, to now deal with Israel's false god. Take your father's bull, the prized bull, 7 years old, and pull down the altar of Baal, and then notice this, that your father has, and cut down the Asherah that is beside it. To go and to tear down an altar to a god is to tear down that particular God. To illustrate that that God is powerless in this scenario. And indeed, notice that this specific altar and place of worship of Baal was set up by Gideon's own father. Gideon's father was the preeminent sponsor of the Baal altar and the Baal worship here at Ophrah. And indeed, his own father was the one sending forth the sacrificial bull for Baal. I think that's what it means when it talks about your father's bull. And the ESV translation says, and the second bull, 7 years old. Most likely the term there is not the second bull, but rather the prized bull. There's not two bulls here, but one. And it's a bull that apparently had been pampered and raised to be offered up in a special sacrificial ceremony unto Baal by Gideon's own father. This explains why the people later on in the narrative are so shocked that the bull is offered up on another altar. This would have been a preeminent expression of worship for Baal by Gideon's own family in Gideon's own hometown. So what is the Lord doing here? The Lord here, on what you could see as Baal's own home turf, using a man from the very family that's constructing and leading Baal worship in this town. He is calling this judge to go and to stand in the face of Israel's idolatry, to tear down the altar that his own father has constructed, to rip down the worship of this false god that his own town has persistently pursued. See, the Lord is teaching us here that he is indeed a jealous God, and he will not share his glory with another. Prior to the Lord going to deliver Israel from the hand of the Midianites, he will make the point abundantly clear before Gideon in our passage tonight that Baal has no power here. The Lord is the Redeemer. The Lord is the Savior of his people, and therefore he is worthy of all of their worship. Baal and Asherah with him were two of the most prominent deities that the people of Israel would whore after in their religious lives. And for the Lord to confront his altar here is to get the people right where it hurts, to hit them right at the most important part of their infidelity to the Lord and call them back to faith with him. Why Baal? Why Asherah? Have you ever asked yourself, why are these two particular gods such a temptation for the life of Israel? I think the answer comes in two ways. First, it's to recognize what Baal and Asherah were the god and goddess of. See, Baal was the god of the rain and the dew, a god whose job it was to provide the rainy season so that the harvests would be bountiful for the people of God. And Asherah, who's often described as his consort, or sometimes the consort of other gods as well, as the goddess of fertility, the one to whom you would go and offer sacrifices so that you could bear children. and have a large family. See, if you think about it, the charge of these two particular idols, these two false gods, was their life and their livelihood. This was an agrarian society. If it doesn't rain for one season, cities could literally be depopulated. People would starve in the famines of this particular time. And you can go and you can even examine an archaeological record of cities being depopulated and abandoned due to various famines in the ancient worlds. And for Asherah, the goddess of fertility, how is it that people can be taken care of in the ancient world in their old age, but by means of their children? You see, having children then was much more than just passing on their name. It was also with that a keeping. It was a way to secure their own livelihood toward the end of their lives. See, Baal and Asherah in particular were gods that were in charge of the day-to-day things that the people of Israel needed to live in their life. The reason why they were so tempted to follow this false god and this false goddess was because they were in need of the rains. They were in need of the harvest. They were in need of many children in their families. But instead of trusting in the Lord, the one who actually has the power to give these things, their hearts were turned to the false idols of the Canaanites. And this gets into a second reason why they are so swayed by these deities. It's because they're not just prominent in the life of idolatrous Israel, but they're prominent in Canaanite systems as well. These would have been the gods that their neighbors and those who were all around them would have been worshiping. And it's hard in a context when you're surrounded by idolatry to maintain faithfulness to the one true God. Do you see the temptation that Israel had? Coming from their idolatrous neighbors, driving them to consider the possibility of greater ease and greater prosperity in this life. They needed to learn that all of those things were lies, that Baal and Asherah were no god or goddess at all, but just gods of wood and gods of stone. And even as we read from Isaiah 44 earlier, mute, deaf, and dumb. Items that, on the one hand, you cut down and cook, lights fire and cook your food over, and then fashion an idol and worship at the same time. Utter foolishness. False gods who are powerless to save. Now, it's easy for us as we look at this particular act of infidelity to the Lord to chastise Israel for it, to say, I would never do such a thing myself. There's no Baal in my life. Well, it's true that there may not be a personal deity named Baal that you offer up sacrifices or prized bulls unto. How often have we sacrificed faithfulness to the Lord, to productivity, to finances, to comfort, and to all of those things in our lives that would have been the job of Baal to provide? You see, Baalism is alive and well in our culture today. The pursuit of prosperity, the pursuit of comfort, the pursuit of not religious fidelity to the Lord, but rather prosperity and comforts and all of those things that can come from the rains in our lives. We must learn. We must learn, as Israel is learning here, to not trust in things of the world, to not place our hope in silver or in gold, but rather to trust in the Lord who saves. The Lord here contends with Baal. He reveals that Baal and Asherah are not gods at all, but instead that he is the God to be feared. And it's important to notice that when the Lord gives Gideon this command, there's not just the negative, go tear down the altar of Baal, but also the positive. to build the altar to the Lord. He is to take stones and to place them in order. To place them in order would be to construct an altar the way Moses had commanded them in the law. And he's to cut up the wood of the Asherah, and he's to offer up a burnt offering upon this altar to Yahweh that he is now called to establish. The Lord is not just revealing through Gideon's actions here the futility of Baal worship. He's promoting the promises of Yahweh worship. He's revealing to the people of Israel the proper manner to worship the one true God. And it's not to go and to pursue Baal or to Asherah, but rather to humble yourself before the Lord and be obedient to his laws concerning his sacrifices, and in that, be a people who are brought into the presence of God, who dwell with the Lord as their God and they as his people. Gideon is calling them through these actions to worship the one true God. The Lord's commands could not be more clear. It's a way of saying, Baal is not God. Even I alone, am the Lord. And as we read in Isaiah earlier, there is no other. But Gideon himself, the one whom the Lord charges with this task, to tear down the altar of Baal, to burn up the Asherah pole beside it, and to construct the altar of the Lord, is conflicted in his labors. Notice verse 27. So Gideon took 10 of his men, of his servants, and did as the Lord told him. But because he was too afraid of his family and of the men of the town to do it by day, he did it by night. The very night, just a few years earlier, when he had seen the presence of the Lord and his holy angel that struck fear in his heart, now in the face of his particular mission, he fears man more than he fears the Lord. Or at least he fears men along with his fear of the Lord. In the midst of his fear of men, he still obeys. He goes and does what the Lord tells him to do. But he doesn't do it in the open. He doesn't humble Baal by day and promote the Lord in the lights. He rather hides it by the cover of night. Beloved, we must be on guard against this fear of man. Well, Gideon himself does go and do what the Lord calls him to do. He does it in such a fashion where the Lord's contention with Baal is muted rather than promoted. But for you, let it not be so. For you, trust in the Lord, who is the one true God. Fear not man. Fear not those who can only hurt the body and can only take things of this life away and cannot harm the soul. Remember what the prophet Isaiah says in chapter 51 and verse 12. He says, I am he who comforts you, who are you that you are afraid of man who dies, and of the Son of Man who is made like grass. Or Solomon, or the Proverbs in Proverbs 29:25, the fear of man lays a snare, but whoever trusts in the Lord is safe. Whenever the fear of man encroaches upon our hearts, and it does, remind yourself of the words of Peter in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 17, to conduct yourself with fear during this time of your exile. And that is not the fear of man, but the fear of the Lord. To remember the Lord, to place your God before your eyes and rest in him in this time of conflict. Well, the Lord has contended with Baal. He has sent Gideon to tear down his altar and to build the altar of the Lord. And we might expect that from this action, perhaps the people would recognize that Baal is not God at all. But instead, we find quite the opposite. In verses 28 through 22, in the response from the town, where the people come not to recognize the impotence of Baal, but rather to come to the defense of Baal. They get up early in the morning and they recognize that the altar has been torn down, and they go on a citywide inquisition to figure out who could have done this terrible and awful act of vandalism to our wonderful Baal temple, and who has offered up our prized bull that we've prepared for Baal on this other altar off to the side. Notice that nowhere in this entire paragraph is the Lord mentioned. The people are furious that their idol has been toppled, but do not reckon with the reality that the Lord is the one who is to be worshipped for it. And also notice that while the people do not see that they should turn to the Lord rather than trusting in Baal, Gideon goes into hiding. Gideon does not stand up like Jonathan does later on in Israel's history to tell him of the things that he had done. Instead, they must search and inquire and find out that Gideon had done it. In fact, Gideon is silent in this entire paragraph. He says nothing to condemn Baal and nothing to promote the Lord. Notice verse 29. They said to one another, "Who has done this thing?" And after they had searched and inquired, they said, "Gideon the son of Joash has done this thing." Their inquisition has yielded results. They find out that Gideon, the son of the very man who has constructed this Baal temple altar, but instead of recognizing that Baal had done nothing to defend himself or his own holy place, they go to Joash, Gideon's father, and they say, "Bring out your son that he may die, for he has broken down the altar of Baal and cut down the Asherah that is beside it." No recognition that Baal has done nothing, that Baal has been nowhere in all of these things. And it's Joash, the leader of Baalism in this town, that stands up and quite ironically condemns Baal and promotes the Lord's. Notice what he says in verse 31. "Will you contend for Baal, or will you save him? Whoever contends for him shall be put to death by morning. If he," that is, if Baal is God, "let him contend for himself, because his altar has been broken down." There's some debate about this verse, about what Joash is doing here. Some would say that perhaps Joash is just defending his son. Others that maybe Joash has finally come to see that Baal is no God at all. But I see it as Joash answering theologically for Baal. He's essentially calling Baal to come and to contend with his own son. Indeed, isn't he the one that renames Gideon in the very next verse, Jerubbaal, which means let Baal contend against him. This is a challenge of God's, if you will. Since Gideon has torn down the altar of Baal, the challenge now is to say, is Baal God? And the answer of our narrative is a resounding no. Baal is no God at all. He has no power to defend the very place of his worship. The home of Baal worship in Israel has been toppled over. Another thing that I hope lends us in that direction is to realize what Joash does not say. Joash does not say, "Will you contend for Baal, or will you save him? Let us worship the Lord whose altar has been constructed." He says, "Only will you save Baal." In many places, the silence provides the answer. Joash's own heart has been so infatuated with Baalism that he's willing to, in essence, proclaim a curse against his own son to let Baal contend against him. And he has not yet realized that it was actually through his son that the Lord has contended with Baal, that the Lord has destroyed Baal's altar and has revealed right before their eyes that Baal is no God at all. He is not worthy of their worship. He is not powerful to deliver them. In fact, if you read verse 32 in the Hebrew, all of it rhymes together, and it forms a sort of curse against Gideon. But by the end of it, with the silence of Baal, with Baal's failure to ever contend with Gideon, the texts have taught us that only the Lord has the power to save his people. They should look to the altar that has been constructed and to the Lord who dwells in the midst of his people and find in him their hope for deliverance. And that's what our text draws our attention to next of all. How the Lord is going to work for the deliverance of his people, not simply from Baalism, but now also from the Midianite oppressors. Verses 33 through 35, Gideon now finally sounds the trumpets and summons the people of Israel for war. And this short paragraph is itself quite shocking because it happens in an important progress. Gideon sounds the trumpets, and then notice in verse 34, the first family that comes out to follow Gideon is the family of the Abiezerites. That is to say, his own clan, from his own town, from his own household. The very same people that just a few verses earlier were trying to put Gideon to death are now the ones that are following Gideon to war. How? Why? Certainly not because Gideon is such a wonderful and charismatic figure. He hasn't said a word. He's done everything by night. Gideon is himself quite weak and quite faithless in this narrative. How is it that this people would come and follow Gideon as the judge, deliverer? The beginning of verse 34 says it all. The Spirit of the Lord clothed Gideon. They do not follow Gideon because he is so strong and mighty. They do not follow Gideon because he is such a wonderful and charismatic leader. They follow Gideon because the Spirit of the Lord has anointed him to be their deliverer. The emphasis of this paragraph is to draw us to recognize that the Lord is the one who is going to deliver his people Israel. So we're seeing not just the impotence of Baal, but now the power of the Lord to save his people. It is through the Spirit upon Gideon that he will lead first his own family. And then on top of that, the armies of Israel begin to gather as hosts before Gideon. From Manasseh, then Asher, then Zebulun, and then Naphtali. Before this one who would so regularly question the word of the Lord, who would be fearful even of his own family and of his own clan to do things by night, who will not respond with a single word to those who would inquire of the destruction of the altar of Baal, now has amassed the forces of Israel behind him. As if the text really wanted to hammer home the point that this is not because of the strength and power of Gideon, but rather because of the Lord who is with him. Gideon's own weakness is highlighted for us once more in our fourth and last point, the sign of the fleece. We would hope that perhaps by this point, Gideon would himself understand the power of God. That perhaps Gideon himself, as the Lord had contended with Baal by his own hand and had been worshipped by Gideon's own actions, that he would recognize that Baal is no God at all. That perhaps because the Spirit had clothed him and the people of Israel have rallied behind him, that he would understand that he was the one the Lord had called to deliver Israel from the Midianites. But instead, we have another twist in the narrative, where the judge not leading the people of Israel to war, but rather testing the Lord and asking for two signs. And two signs in particular that question the word of God. You notice what it says in verse 36. Then Gideon said to God, "If you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said." And then the verse 37 ends, then I shall know that you shall save Israel by my hand, as you have said. Gideon, in offering up and asking for these signs, is not trusting in the word of the Lord that had been directly revealed to him earlier on in the narrative. He's questioning. He's seeking for assurance and trust that the Lord truly is with him and that the Lord truly is God rather than Baal. Have you ever asked yourself, what's up with the fleece? Right? Why this odd sign with fleece and dew? Is it really such a significant thing that on one night the fleece would have dew on it and the ground won't? The other night the ground will have fleece on it or the ground will have dew on it and the fleece won't. What is so important to Gideon about this particular sign, and why is it that this would be an assurance to him that the Lord is with him to deliver Israel? And the answer is to go back to what I was saying earlier. What is Baal the god of? He is the god of the rain and the god of the dew. You see, Gideon's test, his sign here, reveals a significant thing about Gideon's own heart. He had a personal problem with Baal. Baal wasn't just an idol that Israel worshipped. Baal wasn't just an idol that his father propped up in the town. Baal was an issue for Gideon as well. And he's requesting this sign as yet more proof that God is God and not Baal. If God truly has the power to have dew on a fleece in one morning and not on the fleece but all over the ground on the other, then it is definitive proof that God is God and Baal is not, for Gideon's own personal faith. This is not a positive thing, beloved. Unfortunately, many have, and this is how I was taught this narrative when I was a child in Sunday school, to look at this and see God is so gracious with Gideon. Well, so also he'll be gracious with you, and you can test the Lord and he will be found true to you. What does the Lord himself say in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 16? You shall not put the Lord your God to the test, like you tested him at Maas. What should you do? What should you do instead? You should diligently keep the commandments of the Lord your God. While the Lord does here respond graciously to Gideon, Gideon's actions are not positive and they ought never be emulated. His request for a sign here is to illustrate a truth that has already been repeatedly taught to him. Wasn't he to learn from earlier on in chapter 6 in verses 11 through 24 that the Lord is with him to deliver Israel by his hand? And wasn't he to learn from his own actions just a few nights presumably before that God is God and not Baal? Yet here, Gideon once more questions the word of God. Gideon once more tests the Lord. His request for a sign is an act of disbelief in the promises of God and a need for him to have the Lord prove once more that he is God and not Baal. See, Baalism was a problem for Gideon, and Gideon is testing the Lord to see if he is true or not. Yet the Lord is gracious with him. The Lord would have been perfectly just to respond in his wrath against Gideon and raise up a different judge instead. But the Lord was patient with him. The Lord endured with him. While we ought not seek to test the Lord like this, we should not use the grace and patience of the Lord as a pretense for sin. Nonetheless, there is something remarkably beautiful about the Lord's actions here. And it is that the Lord is gracious and merciful to sinners. Gracious and merciful to idolaters who have cherished things in their hearts above the Lord. Gracious and merciful to people who have been wayward away from him gracious and merciful to all of us who in various phases and times of our lives have turned away from the Lord and trusted in the things of this world. But God remains faithful to those whom he has chosen for himself. Indeed, his faithfulness is such that he has sent one far greater than Gideon, even his own son, into the world to live the perfectly righteous life we needed to live with no idolatry, no tincture of sin in his heart or on his hands, such that you, a people like us, who are tainted with idolatry, who are stained by sin, might be redeemed by the shedding of his blood and might be righteous because of his righteousness and because of his work, because of his labors. Let us know that it is true, that he is our God, that he is our Redeemer, and let us worship him in spirit and in truth. Let us endeavor all the more to lay aside all those idols that cling so closely to our hearts. Let us know their true value as not having value at all in terms of ultimate things in life with the Lord. And let us find in Christ all of the treasures and all of the hope that we need to endure in this time of wilderness wandering, casting our gaze forward to that wonderful promise of the resurrection and the new heavens and the new earth that are ours in him. Beloved in the Lord, the preeminent way to fight against all of the idols in your life is to cast your gaze fully and constantly upon Christ, to gaze upon his beauty, to wonder at his majesty, and to let all those pleasures of worldly life grow dim in comparison.